Let's start with, do we need international law? So some of you are already familiar with the humanitarian field. This is a chart from an insurance company, Munich Re, and it just shows numbers of disasters worldwide, stopping in 2011. And it's a little bit hard to see, but here you can see these are the sort of earthquakes, and these go up and down, but you hear, it seems like we're hearing about a lot of earthquakes recently, but they're not necessarily over the aggregate rising. But the trend, as you can see from this trend line, is very clear, right? I mean, it's double what it was between 1980 and 2010. That's a pretty big change, and that is continuing on even off this chart. And all of these other colors here, these are weather-related, climate-related disasters, and these are going up. Up. We see this very clearly in the Red Cross. It's not necessarily all of these massive disasters, although we do see more of those too. These huge storms, these huge cyclones. Most of this rise is in what they call small disasters. A lot of them never attract any kind of international attention, but in the aggregate, they're causing a tremendous effect on development gains. And of course, if you're in the disaster, it may be small for somebody outside, but for you it's a big deal because you're still losing your home, maybe even your life. So there's a lot more disaster business going on, and the UN, the IPCC, the international group of scientists that have been gathered around to tell us what's going on with climate change. What they say in their most recent report is that this is going to continue. That we're already seeing more events, we're seeing more intense events, and regardless what kind of changes are made in the next couple of years to try to slow down emissions, this rise in the amount of sort of natural, supposedly natural events is going to continue over time. The other kind of rise over time has been in the number of folks who might respond internationally to a disaster. In the 19th century, when the Red Cross was born, we were one of just very, very few non-governmental entities that provided assistance in the case of a disaster across borders. But things have changed, particularly, we have the UN now, we have a lot of regional organizations, we have lots and lots of NGOs, and particularly over the last couple of decades, you see quite a proliferation, particularly in disasters that catch media attention. When something gets squarely on CNN, people see it and they want to help. There's a tremendous amount of goodwill across the world to help in these major disasters. But if you take it from the point of view of you're a local civil defense officer or you're the National Disaster Management Agency, a big disaster strikes your country, a typhoon Haiyan, a Haiti-style earthquake, a tsunami. It's already the biggest sort of event that you've had to deal with probably in your lifetime. And then you add on to that not only the coordination of everybody working domestically, but everybody who shows up from the rest of the world. And here's just like among NGOs, when the earthquake hit Gujarat in 2001, there were 100 international NGOs that showed up. In Bam, Iran, there were a little over 100. In Aceh alone, there were nearly 200 international NGOs. In Haiti, they lost count after 500. There were several hundred that responded to the most recent sort of big typhoon in the Philippines. This is a lot of outside actors to try to manage. And it's not just NGOs. I mean, it's government. And this chart just shows foreign militaries. And you see now, I mean, in the past, maybe it was just a neighbor, maybe just one or two, but now it's consistently over a dozen foreign countries sending military. There's been a big rise in the use of civil protection personnel from European countries. We don't send money anymore, we send people from their governments. We send military, we send civilians, we send UN agencies, we send even private sector. And from the point of view of the authorities in the affected state, this can be tricky to manage, right? So they've got more disasters, they've got more potential responders. And here are some of the things that happen in these major disasters. Just a couple of stories. When the tsunami struck in Indonesia, in Aceh, there was a huge outpouring of support. It was one of the major, the biggest sort of humanitarian fundraising successes in a way to respond to this major disaster. But the local sort of systems really couldn't handle it. And so, for instance, this is the then president of Indonesia inspecting relief goods. There were 400 containers of relief in customs waiting to be released 1 year after the tsunami struck. And it was body bags, it was food, and other things that were just stuck, and not yet obviously been able to use. When we were responding to the Chernobyl disaster in the countries affected there, we had wait in customs for medications of over 9 months, for years after Chernobyl struck. But it's not always from the affected state side. I mean, there's also, I don't know if you can see this very well, this is a picture taken in Peru after the Pisco earthquake in 2007. They received 15,000 tons of stuff of various kinds, and a lot of it arrived looking like this. And it's used clothes, it's high-heeled shoes, it's everything that people have in their basements, but not just individuals. It's groups. People and organizations just sort of clear out the attics and send whatever they've got. And instead of responding to the disaster, both civil protection and customs authorities were trying to sort of dig through this and find what could be useful. Tremendous waste of their time, as you can imagine. Another story. This picture here it was taken after the Haiti earthquake a couple of years ago. This woman, you see, she's wearing a T-shirt that says Scientology volunteer minister. So she is healing this woman with her hands, using the power of her mind. They call it an adjust. And the Scientologists now have, over the last couple of years, they've really gotten more and more involved. If you look them up on their website, you'll see that they have very sort of they have a lot of sort of description about how they respond to big disasters. They did it in the tsunami. They did it in this instance. They've done it in a number of other disasters. There's no system at the international level that distinguishes between this woman who's healing people with her mind and UNICEF and the Red Cross. They're treated exactly the same. This, from my point of view, is obviously rather questionable, but there were even concerns in Haiti about people who were sort of more conventionally sort of thought of as doctors, who came down. A lot of doctors came from the United States, who were perfectly competent back home. They knew how to operate when they had a completely sanitary office with lots of sort of equipment. And they found themselves essentially doing operations on the street, doing amputations. Some of them sort of cosmetics surgeons, allergists, and they quickly got out of their league. Haiti doesn't have much of a system for distinguishing one from the other. There wasn't any international system for distinguishing one from the other. These people were allowed to be part of the humanitarian cluster system just like anybody else. Another story. When the Great Japan earthquake struck, there was the earthquake that caused a tsunami that killed many people, and then this created this radiological emergency in Fukushima. There was a group that started up to provide assistance that had a kind of an emotional resonance to the people of Japan. They said, when big disasters happen, these NGOs, they always send the same things. It's tents, it's jerry cans or whatever. We're going to have something that really touches people emotionally. We will ask everybody around the world to send socks. Socks for Japan. Please send us, clean socks, and we will hand them out. This is not the top of, the authorities' list of items that they wanted after the disaster, right? But with the best possible, motives, right? That these people were trying to help. More recent setting, you've heard, I'm sure, a lot about the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa. A lot of legal concerns about that to talk about, but from the point of view of humanitarian assistance, one of them is about whether we can, if we send our doctors, our logisticians, or others, will they be allowed to come home? And we have been told by one of the Federation helps to organize national societies when they send out their expert teams. We call them emergency relief units. So one emergency relief unit from this region of the world has been told that if you go out, we won't let you come home from Sierra Leone. So this is obviously of concern. We in the Federation started looking at this now in 2001. We had seen a lot of these problems in our own operations, but we wanted to understand how widespread it was, what were the experience of other actors. We did several dozen sort of case studies over the course of a number of years. We did surveys, we had meetings all over the world with governments and humanitarians and civil protection and military. And this is what we came up with, basically, is that there's a lot of fairly similar problems in these big disaster operations that have to do with just border crossing. And they're not that different from any other kind of international business. If you want to sell books across a border, you might face some of these things too. But there's the added issue if we want to save lives, and people are in desperate humanitarian need, and that makes it particularly urgent to get it done correctly. So we have problems with especially with governments just not really having any clear rules about how they're going to deal with international assistance, which is the case in many, many countries. Very few, even those that receive quite a lot of outside assistance, have come up with clear, comprehensive procedures for these. How do you get your visa? Do you waive visas? What are the rules for customs? Do you have to pay taxes? Do you have to register? If you're a doctor, are you allowed to work, or do you have to go through a special kind of process of registration? In most places, that takes over a year to do. Maarit might mention what it's like here in Finland. I mean, it's within the EU. Supposedly, it's automatic, but in fact, there's still a registration requirement that states can put on foreign doctors, even from within the EU, and that can take up to a month. They get literally truckfuls of pharmaceuticals, a lot of them with open bottles and with labels in languages that were not spoken there. It was not just a waste of time, but it was literally toxic waste that had been dumped on the country. So you have both over-regulation, under-regulation at the same time. And so just a word a little bit also about the sort of humanitarian system in general and where things are headed. This is from this Global Humanitarian Assistance Report for Development Initiatives that came out this year. And if you look here, you see this is how humanitarian assistance has been channeled. So almost, the lion's share of UN assistance goes through UN agencies. Some of this is then subcontracted down to NGOs, mostly international NGOs, but they get a huge chunk of this humanitarian assistance. International NGOs, big diverse group, but they get a substantial chunk of this donor assistance. Red Crescent has its place, and then we start getting down to the local NGOs. They get about 2%, a lot of it coming through here, and this is the government of the affected country. So you might have millions, even a billion Swiss franc appeal. But you have hundreds of millions in these major operations. This is how much is going to the affected state, and we expect the affected state to be in charge, right? But how can you be in charge and running the show when you are this one and everybody else has got all the money? And they're starting to complain about this, and with some good reason. Another thing to look at in here is in terms of how humanitarian assistance is generally spent, and. This sort of general relief gets the lion's share, which makes sense, relief items. There's food that also has a pretty large percentage here. Only 6% of humanitarian assistance goes to rehabilitation or reconstruction. And then 6%, which is actually a huge increase on what it used to be just a couple of years ago, goes to any kind of preparedness. So we know that you can get a much, much better return from preparing and from reducing risks before the disaster strikes than from spending for it afterwards, but this is how much we're spending on it. So we have a system that's a little bit out of whack according to even what we say what we want to do. We're not necessarily putting our euros in that direction. So those are some issues that have to do with international cooperation. Maybe you need some international rules to handle this when providing assistance to another country or sending somebody to another country. I also want to make the case that there's some questions that may be relevant to international law for the response that happens completely at the national level in natural disasters. And this is not necessarily obvious because, it's clear, isn't it, when we're talking about this, what they call man-made disasters, if there's a chemical spill that somehow somebody might have done something wrong, right? Because we built the plant and maybe someone's negligent. There's a kind of the intervention of people in there. But there's also the intervention of people in what they call natural disasters. And there's a couple of examples. This was a picture from Vladivostok, from a flood that struck there in 2001. And what happened was they had, for several years before that, there had been a number of reports to the authorities. They have a river, and then there was a reservoir of water. And they had been receiving reports that the river was cluttered with stuff, with old cars and like garbage and all sorts of things, and it was all kind of congested. And according to their hydrologists, if it rained too much, they would have to sort of release a lot of water very fast from that reservoir, and it could flood out the communities around that. And even though there had been zoning rules on the books, the local authorities had not been enforcing them, and people had been building right along this river. Well, there was an extraordinary rains in 2001. With apparently a very little warning, they opened up the spigots. Floods went everywhere. 2 meter high water. Just not too many people were killed, but a lot of property was damaged. And a lot of people had to flee. This case actually ended up coming to the European Court of Human Rights. Several of the folks who were affected, they brought a case on this to domestic courts, and they couldn't get any satisfaction. They ended up going to the European Court of Human Rights, and the European Court found that the authorities had violated people's right to life and right to property because they had not basically responded to the warnings they had. They hadn't warned the people. They hadn't acted to evacuate them, and they had let the water out. And they hadn't cleaned up beforehand, and they hadn't done anything to enforce their zoning. So there's a human rights element here. These people were essentially not being taken care of, and at least one court was finding that this was something that could be actionable in law. Another example here is from the United States. This is in New Orleans. Right before Hurricane Katrina hit, there was an evacuation order that was given to everybody in the city. But there's a tremendous number, tens of thousands in New Orleans who didn't own cars. This is how in the U.S., this is how we evacuate. They didn't have a car, and there was no plan for these people with the car. And there was a huge disparity in races. If you were African American, you were 2.5 times as likely not to have a car as if you were white. And so the people left over, a lot of the people left behind that you saw on the TV if you were watching, were blacks, and they had not been taken into account in this evacuation plan. So again, there's a potential discrimination issue here that international human rights may have something to say about. Last example is from the Philippines. After Typhoon Haiyan struck 3 of the islands in the Visayas region, caused tremendous damage in the Tacloban area, and also some in some of the other regions. The government decided that they were going to have a no-build area along the shore, 400 meters all the way across, all around the islands. And so you said, find someplace else to live. But the people who were there, basically, they were fishermen. They absolutely relied on that, and they had nowhere else to go. And the humanitarian community pushed back and said, "Look, it doesn't make sense that it should be exactly the same amount, amount of space everywhere across the island. Let's look at, what the shore conditions are. This is just arbitrary." And so sometimes when even if you're trying to help, you can end up in a kind of human rights pickle. And sometimes there's not enough thinking about it, even in the Philippines, which is usually pretty well kind of attuned to this. So there's some elements of kind of rights issues that happen even in so-called natural disasters. So Is there any international law? I've mentioned a couple of types of international law. Can anybody else suggest a kind of international law that applies to any of these questions? We had some lawyers in the room. No? Doctors? Yes. International humanitarian law? What's that? I saw somebody over here is shaking their head. No? Yes?
Well, Finland has a lot of bilateral treaties or...
Bilateral treaty, yeah. What about humanitarian law? Does this help us?
No,
No? Why not?
because it's not an armed conflict.
Humanitarian law basically applies in armed conflicts, and so if it's not armed conflict, then it's not going to apply. Any other type of international law?
You mentioned already human rights.
Human rights law. What's the sort of the keystone of international law? What's the main kind of, if we're thinking about international response, like what's the main kind of notion of international law that would jump to mind? Can I come to Finland and do whatever I want if I'm Switzerland? No, why not? It's not because we have better chocolate. It's because of this notion of it's called sovereignty, and this is sort of considered the keystone of international law, which is it's not always been like this. It's only been several hundred years, but there's this notion from the Westphalian approach to international law that basically every country has an equal international rights in theory, right? And so this is law professors call them like billiard balls. Like you can knock up against them, but you can't go through, right? Because they're sovereign in their own territory. And this has been written directly into the UN Charter, which is probably the most important global treaty. So you have exclusive competence. However, just like you, I mean, you have the right, if you rent your apartment, you have a right to tell people to get out of your apartment. However, if you sign up to Airbnb and you decide to have somebody come and stay in your apartment, then you can't say, well, I don't want you here, right? Because you have contracted away some of your sovereign right in your apartment. And states can do the same thing. They can have all of the rights, exclusive competence, but they can give up some of that by signing bilateral agreements or regional agreements and that kind of thing, and say, okay, well, we're gonna agree to do certain things. One of the things that states have agreed to that's an important aspect of international law, both in conflicts and disasters, is what we call humanitarian principles. There are at least three that are very widely shared. We call them the principle of humanity, which is basically that you should act wherever there is need in response to that need. Neutrality, which is something that's at least something that the Red Cross still adheres to, that you shouldn't be taking any kind of sides. Independence from government if you are a humanitarian actor, and impartiality, so that you are not discriminating in the aid you're giving. These aren't actually written in a treaty anywhere, though, as they're written here. The way that they are mostly kind of globally accepted is through a UN General Assembly resolution, which is a very important formal document, but it's not legally binding. And we have a number of sort of humanitarian created documents, like the Code of Conduct of Red Cross and NGOs, and the Sphere Charter and Minimum Standards. That's kind of the accepted document that say, yes, we agree with these principles. There's a little bit of sort of controversy. There are a number of NGOs that no longer want to be considered neutral. They don't see that as an important humanitarian principle anymore. They want to go and take sides essentially with people who are in trouble, and they don't want to hold back. They would like to sort of this Médecins Sans Frontières approach. They will give voice to their concerns. So I mean, the impartiality is mentioned in the 14th Geneva Convention, but it doesn't necessarily say you have to be neutral. But what we don't have in the field of disaster law, the way you have in international humanitarian law, is like a single flagship treaty at the center that everybody points to. like the Geneva Conventions, or if you think about trade, like the GATT. There's not a single, like one treaty in the center that everybody can refer to. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of law out there. So I mentioned human rights that can relevant. There are very few human rights treaties that specifically talk about disasters, but a few of them do. You have refugee law that could be indirectly applicable. Maarit mentioned bilateral agreements. There are a lot of bilateral agreements, particularly in Europe and between European countries and outside countries. There's been, over the last couple of decades, a lot of regional agreements and a regional sort of focus on solving these problems regionally that I'll talk about more in a second. And we call it sort of sectoral law, but there's some treaties that are really about something else, where someone has decided to throw in something about disasters that kind of are important in this field. But for the most part, the whole international system for responding to disasters is sitting on what lawyers call soft law. So it's not binding, it's not like a contract, you can't go to court on it, but it's based on some kind of very formal, very well accepted, morally authoritative document. And we have some special soft law that applies to us in the Red Cross because of our long history. And then there's other soft law like codes and guidelines that apply to other actors. I won't go into detail about the treaties, but just to mention a couple of them on these sort of sectoral treaties. There are some treaties that are specifically about customs and disasters, and they have really good detailed provisions, but are unfortunately only signed by very few states. There was actually, last year, there was this amazing, if maybe short-lived, attempt to revive the Doha round of world trade, if any of you have followed that. And they decided, it's been basically deadlocked for years and years and years, and they decided, okay, we're going to try to bring this up through an agreement on customs facilitation. It doesn't specifically refer to disasters, but there are a lot of provisions in there that could be used for a humanitarian situation, but currently it's still in some question because India is now no longer willing to sign up to it. There are a couple of treaties in the sort of transport field, like in the major treaty on civil aviation has an annex that has a couple of paragraphs in there about UN relief operations. There's a convention on maritime traffic, has some bits and pieces on this. The disaster-specific treaties have tended to have pretty low ratification rates. So this is a convention on civil defense assistance, has just about 13 countries. But that's not always the case. So there's a major treaty, global treaty called the International Health Regulations. It's really about epidemic control. And it has the particularity that this kind of treaty, when it's adopted by the World Health Assembly, you have to opt out once it's agreed. Normally when you have a treaty, you sign it first and then you ratify it. And a lot of times you sign and then forget, right? It never gets ratified. So we have a lot of treaties that just sit and wait for years, if not decades. This one, though, when it's through the World Health Association, you sign it, and then if you don't opt out, you're considered to be bound. So almost every country is subject to this very powerful treaty. This treaty also, the Convention on Assistance in the Event of a Nuclear Accident, has over 100 parties, even though there are only 30 countries in the world that have nuclear power, so that's pretty good. Unfortunately, though, I mean, it's about situations like when there's a major nuclear accident and states want to help each other. This came up right after Chernobyl, and the big chance they had to use this was in Fukushima, but Japan specifically didn't want to invoke it because they didn't want to give anybody any rights, and so they said, well, we're not asking for it under the treaty. So much for the 100 parties treaty, right? So we have some treaties. It's not that we don't have any, but they're not really solving some of the problems I talked about. So when we in the Federation we negotiated what we call a soft law document in 2006 and 2007. And so there's sort of recommendations to governments about what they can put in their national law about international assistance that looks at both sides, both on the kind of red tape that an outsider might come across, try to put them through a kind of fast lane, but also setting up standards that they have to abide by. And so basically, and making them conditional. Like if you want to stay in the fast lane, get special facilities as a humanitarian organization, then you need to be coordinating, you need to be giving adequate quality. We've been working with societies now in over 50 countries. 17 of them have passed laws so far. There are another 15 or 16 or so that are pending, but it's slow work. Another important sort of soft law document that you may have heard about, this is the main international document when it comes to prevention of disasters, disaster risk reduction. And it's called the Hyogo Framework for Action. And it set up these 5 priorities. Has what governments and others are supposed to do to try to sort of really stop these disasters from happening in the first place, stop them from affecting so many people in the first place. And it had a time limit. So we're just in the middle now of a negotiation process for the successor for this, for a new instrument. And one of the things that's come out of the kind of review of progress so far is that they've done pretty good on this. They've done pretty well on this one, especially preparedness. The others are going fairly well, and what we've really failed on is this one, like actually not having people live right next to the river. This one is where the rubber meets the road. It starts really affecting people's livelihoods, and that's really hard, and we have a lot of road to still travel on that. And there's a tremendous amount of interest and engagement on this in the regional level. Lots of regional treaties being sort of popping up all the time. There's a new one happening in Central America right now. There's a new Arctic treaty recently on rescue and assistance. There's a new treaty in the South Asian region, the SARC treaty. There was in Africa, they adopted a human rights convention about displacement within your own country. There's lots of provisions in there about natural disasters. There's quite a lot going on, and of course a lot in Europe as well. But there's a little bit of a tendency for them to create their own little worlds. Some of them are creating their own sort of coordination mechanisms, their own standards, and the problem arises if you have somebody from here goes here, and of course they're not part of this treaty, then this treaty is not as effective anymore, and the same is true over here. Last point on this, there's a body of the United Nations called the International Law Commission, and it's a group of legal experts that are elected by states. Their main job is to what they call progressively codify customary international law, basically to make draft treaties, although they can do other things. They have been working for 7 years, I think now, on essentially what they call draft articles. They don't say what it is. It's articles of something, but basically it's a draft treaty. And they work. They only have one session a year. They work fairly slowly. They've come to the end of their first draft, and they've now sent that out to states for comment. And they will probably be presenting it to the UN General Assembly in 2016 as a kind of global treaty on disaster cooperation and protection issues. And this is the fellow, is a Colombian sort of scholar who is in charge of the project for them. So we may see in not too distant future development of a stronger global legal framework. So just a couple of words about domestic law. The major way that countries, sort of the first kind of law that you think about usually is a sort of the National Disaster Management Act, the Rescue Act, or something like that. Most countries have some kind of national legislation, although some of them don't. And it's surprising to see, countries that have lots and lots of disasters, particularly in Africa, a lot of them haven't had an act, or don't even have a policy yet. Kenya, for instance, doesn't have one. Uganda doesn't have one. Ethiopia doesn't have a disaster management act. Bhutan just adopted its first disaster management legislation ever. Zambia, Namibia. It's surprising. Cambodia has something that's been pending for a long time, but they don't have this kind of basic national legislation on this issue. But most countries do, and what most of these acts do basically is they're mostly like organizational charts. And almost all the text is about who sits in what box and who talks to whom. And this can be very important because basically a disaster is what happens when you go from a local emergency to something that's so big that you need somebody else to get involved. And that process of deciding whether it's an emergency that sort of local authorities should take over, or a provincial authority, or national, is very important to get right, and is very political in many cases, and often is a bit of a problem. So we see in some cases where it's actually, unfortunately, you can do this wrong. So for instance, in Ghana, the National Disaster Management Agency has been put within the Ministry of Interior, but it's lower than the most head of department. So they're supposed to be leading the entire government when it comes on disaster management, but they're very low in the hierarchy. So you can imagine how much leadership they're able to exercise. Pakistan, a couple of years ago, it had a Ministry for Disaster Management. They changed it to the Ministry for Climate Change. There was just the issue of the moment. I mean, climate change is important, but Pakistan also has lots of other types of emergencies and disasters, including enormous earthquakes, among others that are not necessarily linked to climate change. There's a number of countries that have not really resolved the kind of potential turf battles between various agencies. It's really too bad when you get this kind of institutional thing wrong. The other issue that can be complicated is, everyone's heard of the kind of the state of emergency, right? There's a lot more declarations of state of emergency than there are clear rules about what that even means. There are countries that adopt that, sort of like for instance in Kenya, they'll declare a state of emergency. They don't have any kind of law that says what it is, right? But a government in most cases to set aside all of their rules, including civil rights, for a certain period of time, usually extremely limited period of time. But it's really quite a sledgehammer for a small problem of kind of technical need in a natural disaster. And so sometimes governments don't want to declare an emergency. It looks bad. It looks like I'm going to lose tourism dollars. It looks like I'm going to have a huge sort of battle with my legislature, and so they don't do it. And that can be a trouble if you want to provide assistance and they haven't declared emergency. Then some agencies can't do it. Other countries have moved away from this, and they've created through legislation a sort of state of disaster, which is a special legal framework, but it's not quite as intense as this one. You don't set aside all human rights, but you can, for instance, change your customs rules. You can change how fast you can get an appropriation. Some of these other things that are a little bit more technical, but obviously really important in disaster. From our sort of analysis, what we've been doing on this, I mean, basically we see most disaster management legislation is still very focused on response. Bad thing is happening, run out and help. Even though the disaster management community now is very clear that we should be putting our energy in risk reduction, trying to prevent things, trying to make people more resilient in the first place, the laws haven't really caught up with that yet. The other issue is that they really focus on the sort of technical experts. The police will do this, and the Ministry of Health will do that. But in most countries, civil society, church groups, volunteer organizations, Red Cross play a huge role. They tend to get left out of laws and operating essentially on their own, which is a huge wasted effort, including private sector also. They do their thing. They're not really very connected. There's a big separation, legally anyway, between so-called natural disasters, man-made disasters, health emergencies. They'll all be handled by different ministries, usually different regimes, even though it's now starting to be difficult to kind of justify the different titles for these. And most laws don't talk much about rights. They don't talk much about recovery either after the disaster. We did a big study about this just recently with UNDP. We looked at 30 countries, their laws, to see what kind of rules they have on disaster risk reduction. And we found that in almost every country, the authority for dealing with disasters is put at the lowest level, at least for implementation. It's the mayors, it's local authorities, and they often don't have the means to carry out all these responsibilities. They may not even be aware of it. They don't have the experts, and they don't have, in many cases, a kind of political push. Like the people who work in a disaster management agency sitting in the capital, they live and breathe this, they think about it all the time. But when it's decentralized implementation, all of that kind of gets stuck in the capital. There's also a bit of a problem with funding when it comes to risk reduction. It's very clear a lot of countries have funds for a response. They don't necessarily have clear funds for prevention. And so the money goes to response, and we never spend the money on prevention or preparedness up front. And the other big gaps is how do you hold people accountable when they haven't done what they're supposed to do to try to protect people, to warn people. In many places that's really just not at all articulated in law. And one thing that's also kind of curious is very few countries have put formal rules about early warning in disasters. This is just kind of left to the scientific agencies. The assumption is everything will be clear, but sort of having clear, accurate, appropriate warnings after disasters sometimes takes quite a lot of institutional sort of lockstep, and without clear rules, you may not get it. Just a quick word on this, it's not just about a disaster management legislation. There are actually lots and lots of laws that are carrying the weight when it comes to prevention. Building codes, land use, environmental laws, natural resource laws, and a lot of them are not thinking about disasters per se, and they haven't really sort of integrated it very well. Having said that, what we find is that you don't necessarily want to have the same kind of law in every country. It depends on your system. Like if you have really good land sort of use rules, you have really good building codes, you have really good environmental laws, you won't need to put so much in your disaster management legislation on prevention because it's already handled in these other laws. On the other hand, if you don't have these things, then you need a big, sort of solid disaster management legislation. So we came up with this chart kind of depending on the kind of country and the kind of legislation you may want to put together. So this is my final slide. What we hear from practitioners is, there are lots and lots of challenges of providing international humanitarian relief in disasters, logistical problems, but these kind of red tape barriers are one of the biggest, most expensive from their point of view, and from the affected state point of view, the feeling of being inundated with expectations and with things and people you don't need is one of their big concerns. There are international frameworks of law on this, but they've got lots of little holes in them, and they're not very well known. There's domestic law on this, but also has a lot of gaps, and hasn't been really followed by lawyers particularly. There's been a push over the last 20 years to improve law and policy frameworks, particularly to make it more focused on preparedness and risk reduction. You see a lot more language about this, including here in Finland, but it's still not really. It still also has a lot of gaps, particularly when it comes to funding, accountability, and involvement of civil society. Okay, so you've been very patient.
Thank you very much for your lecture. You covered a lot of the bases that I was going to take as well, and you gave a good background for what I was going to say. So the project that I was part of, I was hired as a legal consultant to compile this report about Finnish legislation and practices, about how Finnish officials would act in a situation if we would receive international aid. And it was an eco project that consisted of 4 other countries. There was Poland, Latvia, Ireland, and Iceland, and also the IFRC. And there was, in every country, there was the national societies of the Red Cross, and also the national officials who would be responsible for implementing and overseeing disaster response. So in Finland, obviously, the Finnish Red Cross, and then in Finland, it's the Ministry of Interior Affairs and their Department of Rescue Services. So the report was compiling the rules and how they correspond in international rules and guidelines, and also made recommendations on how it could be improved. And I started my work in April 2013, and the final report was approved in March this year. And it's the first this type of extensive report on international disaster response. So like was said earlier, that it is not so well seen to in national states. So the background papers that I used mainly, there was the host nation support guidelines. They are an EU document. These are all non-binding. And the host nation support guidelines, they are for the purpose is to support and assist affected states in receiving international assistance, and it also highlights key actions that should be taken. And then there's the IDRL guidelines that was already discussed, and it covers a bit more also the NGO parts, and the host nation support guidelines more targeted to state assistance. And then there's also the Model Act, which provides very good practical advice and proposals for legislation. So, why in Finland? So many might say that, or it is true that Finland is a fairly safe society, and the risk of large-scale disaster is fairly low, but some might say it's impossible. And I think that kind of attitude is kind of prevalent, and it can also be a hindrance to implement effective legislation when people don't have the mindset that something drastic could happen here, and for us to require to ask for help. So in Finland, if you look at the country profile, Finland has many nuclear power plants, and there's going to be some more apparently. But in case of a disaster there, it could possibly have very widespread effects and complex effects, and it could have cross-border effects in many countries. And that could include health risks, contamination of water and food, evacuations, etc. Also, Finland has very varied weather conditions, changes in temperature and weather conditions, and it is said in the Finnish society security plan that natural disasters are the biggest threat to Finland. And also, as was shown in the scale, that the number of disasters has increased, and in some reports it said that it's in 20 to 30 years it has quadrupled globally. So it's relevant, and also the sea traffic in the Baltic Sea could be one good example. An oil tanker spill could have widespread effects and long-term effects in the archipelago of Finland or by the coast. So how I executed this study was I looked at the background papers obviously, and also got to know the legislation. I conducted interviews with different government officials and experts, and I met them personally or then through email exchange, but it was quite a list of different officials and agencies, going all the way from the Finnish Red Cross to the Finnish Food and Safety Authority. And you can see the list in the first couple of pages. And challenges that I faced with this was that it is a fairly new way to systemize law, and there's not really a comprehensive ensemble, that it's very sectorized legislation, and there's not a common name for it in Finnish law. Also, there was various branches of law that is involved, like from regulations on food and animals, and all the way to criminalization of and money laundering laws and international treaty law, diplomatic regulations, all these issues. And also the different competencies of the administrative branches, that not necessarily all the branches, they have their own competencies that is named in law, but they don't necessarily know each other's obligations and tasks, and you can find how do you say it? Inconsistencies in the practices. And one example comes to mind from the workshop that we had, that there was a couple of ministries that mentioned that they had done the host nation support work in their respected ministry, and none of the others were aware of it. So that shows part of the problem. And also I go back to the terminology, the correspondence with the terminology, because Finnish law is very strictly written and different concepts in law. It's all the ministries are very precise on what's their job. So also the rescue service, it's used mainly to describe the rescue services, but in the international documents it has a bit wider sense. So this is just once more to describe the difficulty that might be faced if you think of some international operator coming in, and if there's a different bureaucracy and not a consistent approach to international aid, who should they turn to? So I go to the main findings of the study. I wrote 31 recommendations, I think, in the end of the report, and there probably could be more, because I came as an outsider to this, which was kind of a strength as well, because I think people opened up to me more. But also it was a bit of a hindrance because there's so many fields of expertise, and I could only, I think, scratch the surface, and I think there's much more to be done. But overall, Finland is a very organized state and a legislative state, and there's nationwide security strategies and legislation that is being revised consistently and continuously. And 2011 was it when it came in power, there was the National Rescue Act that was legislated, which is now considered a framework law for disaster management. Also, I think there was a lot of interest into this subject, and a lot of the administrative branches and the officials, they were very knowledgeable of the contents of the law and the international obligations. However, going to the recommendations and the problems, I'll just highlight a few of them here. What I would recommend more is to have more cooperation with different branches of administration, and not just only in the planning stage, but in a consistent manner. The sectoral approach it seems to be ineffective, because talking to one ministry, then the other would say another thing, and I don't think they would all come together in a sense that would make a coherent ensemble of what would be done in a situation. Also, well, going back to terminology once again, I think it should not be looked at so closely. I think they should look at the functions that are described in these international mechanisms and model regulations that should be the decisive factor. And also, well, what was mentioned was the temporary recognition of professional qualifications. That came up really early on in the work, that people were saying that doctors have to work here in a criminal construct of necessity or exigency, which is called pakkotila in Finnish. And they would have to practice medicine in an emergency situation relying on this necessity, and it has very strict limitations to how it can be used. And in the official way, the doctors, if they came here to practice medicine, they would have to be certified by a Finnish authority, and that takes around 3 months if you're from a European Union country, and 4 months if you are from a third state, so to speak. Also, the legal competence of different disaster response operators, as was discussed, it's very important when thinking about accountability issues, and also just their thinking of how they might be able to operate here. There can be state-level operators, private associations, private individuals. What are their legal competencies, and how can they operate. Just thinking maybe, for example, opening bank accounts and entering into contracts with locals and so forth. But yeah, and the final one is more research that I would, or more effort and cooperation I think is needed to bring these all sectoral participants together. So that's it. Thank you.